It may not be your fault, but it will be your responsibility. Many of us millennials grew up with movies like Lord of the Rings, and now if we look into the atmosphere, the stratosphere that is media today, whether it's video games or movies or books, in books to less extent, let's just be clear, or if we observe things like politics, if we spend too much time on social media, we might encounter this repeated theme, this repeated resounding reminder that what was better than what is now, and there's no going back. We're in our 30s already being beset with nostalgia, as if we were the first generation to look back on our childhood with some sort of fondness. And the way that we describe our era, and the way that we look at things like video games or post-apocalyptic themes in TV shows, or just even things like urban exploration, illustrate a not necessarily unique, but pointed example of what it means to be alive today. Now, how are we going to... Now, I want to talk about a principle. I want to bring up this concept of responsibility and guilt, or responsibility and fault, as if we seem like we were given the hand, we were given a deck of cards that weren't great, but at the same time, we are expected to be great with them. And the quote, the line that ever presently comes to mind is that one by Gandalf in The Return of the King, where he is talking to Pippin about how we may not be able to choose the time that we are alive, but we do get to choose what we do with the time that we have. Now, that is a bad paraphrase, and you might wonder how it is that I'm going to be able to go from this and to talk about the episode sponsor and carry on, and that is simply as straightforward as I can. This show is made available to you and for you on two different accounts. One of them is yourself, and the other one is it has been made possible by Obsidian Arms. Now, Obsidian Arms is a tool and part manufacturer. They are a machine shop out of Minnesota, and they provide a number of goods and services that will be applicable to you in multiple different ways. Whether you're looking to figure out how to take a hard concept, a product that you have been working on, and bring it into real life to make it real, or if you are looking for toolkits for the amateur and professional gunsmith, go to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. And as I have pointed out, I will point out once again, you should also look at their firing pin. It has a feature that sets it apart from many others. But this show is available to you for free on the platform because you watch it, because you are interested in what we have to say, and then also because you share it, and because of sponsors like Obsidian Arms. So if you want to support the show, give them a check. That being done, let us return to the phrase. It may not be your fault, but it will be your responsibility. We do not get to choose the time that we are alive. The millennial generation and subsequent edges about it oftentimes can be illustrated in phrases like, born too late to discover the world, born too early to discover the stars, or the late stage empire feeling of America certainly points to the feeling that many of us millennials experience in our life. And that is that the best years of our lives are already behind us, and we have no real hope for the future. Now, I want to challenge this mentality, and I want to challenge this disposition towards the world, because ultimately, it's not that it's simply fatalistic, but that it puts us in a position where we won't act and don't act. And instead of looking at the failures of the past, we continue their collapse into the future. Now, it's worth mentioning that the era that is known currently as the Dark Ages is an era that in our history books and in our sort of cultural memory is presented almost as a dark time for mankind, where people lived in shadow. They didn't have books or reading. This was before the Enlightenment. And it's very odd to see how the phrase the dark times or the dark ages really it only exists if we contrast it to what came before and what came after. And we perhaps do ourselves a disservice by not recognizing the great amount of literature that came out from that period. But before we do so, we can also be encouraged to recognize that people made it through hard times in the past. And I'm saying this now, in this kind of open-ended context to address, to maybe acknowledge, but then also respond to this zeitgeist of our generation, maybe a small version of it, a microcosm zeitgeist, which seems to grip so many minds and lives and hearts and people at this time. And that is this feeling that we will not get to endure or enjoy the benefits of the golden age, and that we are going to have to go through hard times. There's a couple of books that have become popular based on this notion, most notably The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe, which is where we get the strong men produce good times, good times produce weak men produce bad times, or hard times produce strong men. And this cyclical feeling of the world always comes with a air or tone of doom that we are about to encounter the hard times. But what happens if I challenged your notion and said that we're not approaching them, we are in them? If we go back to this conversation between Gandalf and Pippin in The Lord of the Rings, at least the video series made by Peter Jackson, which quite possibly will end up being one of the best series of film ever made, but if we look back into the context that he is talking to, Pippin is scared because they are in the city of Minas Tirith, which is about to be attacked by a great army. And there is this sense of doom, quite literally, as they don't know where Frodo and Sam are, but Frodo and Sam are approaching Mount Doom to destroy the One Ring, to essentially defeat the evil bad guy. And so in the story of The Lord of the Rings, there is a pretty clear line between good and evil being painted at this time, where the forces of evil seem overwhelming and strong and powerful. And many of us millennials grew up watching these movies, thinking and observing to some extent that sense of foreboding and fear, but then also admiring the courage of the characters to face it. And yet when we panned our view off of the screen into the world around us, we did not find ourselves surrounded by dragons, but by cockroaches. Instead of some glorious French Revolution with its flags and its guillotines, we got the Summer of Love. Instead of these great enemies to face, like the Red Terror or the Nazis, our observation of that which was going on in the world was corruption within our own society. Instead of being faced with articulate but powerful enemies, we found out that most of what we are arguing with are barely literate at best, and yet we are depressed or angered or frustrated by not having, say, a great goal to accomplish. In my own life, I have talked about perhaps, and I need to write more specifically about the experience of going into the military, expecting it to give me a sense of identity, and finding and preparing myself physically and mentally for this thing called RIP, which is the Ranger Indoctrination Process, or the selection process for Ranger Battalion, only to discover when I got there that I was in one of the first classes where they essentially made it easy enough to let most of us through. And so instead of having some great achievement or some sense of accomplishment in graduating from the Ranger Indoctrination Program and being selected to go to battalion, instead we stood there amongst people who we didn't even know if they were to be considered our peers, because the standards had been lowered so far as to allow people in. Now, I want to paint this picture, and I'm trying to put this in the context that, in a sense, by not having the great challenge that it was to overcome this obstacle of selection, but rather having the door kind of sloppily thrown open for us, it diminished our value of the place that we were in. But it also struck a blow to, I believe, it struck a blow to the identity of many of us. And we got to, and we got to see and feel the aftermath of such effects, even if we were not able to articulate it. In this way, and in this first experience of getting into the prestigious Ranger Battalion by what seemed like a dirty trick, it cost even us, probably most on the individual level, a sense of belonging very quickly. And so instead, we struggled to figure out who we were and what we were doing, and it led to a catastrophe within the morale of the unit. Now, what does this do for us today, and what does it do for us today? If you want a window into what it feels like to be in Ranger Battalion, it's that every generation and every team that came before you, every phase or whatever that was before you, was both more difficult and more auspicious than what you are going through now. I am 10 years removed from my deployments in Ranger Battalion, and every once in a while I encounter a conversation with another younger Ranger who speaks with a sense of awe that I came from that time, because those are supposed to be the golden years of Ranger Battalion or Ranger Battalion deployments for the global war on terror. And yet when I remember my time in, I looked back 2 or 3, 4 years to what I thought was the golden years of being in Ranger Battalion, where the rules of engagement were just right and our leadership was just right, and so on and so forth. And so perhaps there's a note to be made here that do not be surprised if you come to believe that everything better came before you and you arrived too late. In fact, that is a feeling of that is an element of what it feels like to be a millennial, in the sense that you were born too late to enjoy the economic benefits of the boomer generation, and you are going to be saddled with the economic responsibilities of the bad decisions made by those who came before us. I didn't have any hand in the development of the Federal Reserve. I didn't have any hand in the selection of fiat currency as the choice that we live in. I didn't get to choose the consequences of the Cold War, or I didn't get to have some vote in whether or not a president who was a person who was a president either before my birth. We'll use this example. That I didn't get to choose that a president who existed before my birth gave away or infringed on my rights to freely or exist in this world or defend myself. I didn't get to choose the NFA or the ATF, or I didn't get to make these decisions. In fact, by the time now in my age, where I am in my 30s, it seems like I don't know if I have the ability to influence such things. But you do. And I think there's an important element here. And in this sense, I am speaking to myself just as much as I am speaking to you, in a way that a writer writes a book about how one ought live, not because he's trying to convince other people to live this way alone, but that he's trying to convince himself to live a certain way. This time that we live in might feel punctuated by a doom, that by a sense of doom that the stage has been already set up against us, and there is no path forward to attain this idea that we were supposed to have, that the American dream is dead, or that all these things are behind us, that the consequences of our life have been predetermined by those who came before us. There may be a sense of doom that it is already too late, that we have nothing to accomplish, and that we will never have the glory of dying in battle, as the memes say. But I want to challenge this notion, and I want to bring it back to that phrase and conversation between Pippin and Gandalf. And in the context of that story, they are looking at the great evil on their doorstep. And yet in the context of our story, we oftentimes see the signs of decay everywhere. The economy is worse off. Our families are less capable of doing things that were just easier before us. If I sold my home, let's use this as an illustration. If I sold my home for the amount of value that my grandparents' house has gained in their lifetime, and I'm saying that they bought their house for X amount of dollars, and it's currently valued at Y amount of dollars. If I were to be able to get the same change in value, this modest middle-class home that I live in would be selling for $60 million. Now, put that into punctuation. This makes our world feel like we do not have the economic possibility of those that came before us. And worse, we can feel a little bit like it was squandered by previous generations, and now we have to pay the price. But unlike Pippin and Gandalf, we are not up against some great dark lord. We do not have some easily identified terms of victory. The terms of victory for the Lord of the Rings series was the destruction of the ring. That's all that needed to be done to attain victory in that world. And they had the convenience of a easy to define but very difficult to accomplish task. And we are living in an era where the tables might be completely inverted, where we have we seem to not have an easily defined presentation of what victory is, but whatever it is, it's just barely out of reach, or it feels just barely out of reach. The task that Frodo and Sam, or the Lord of the Rings characters, were given seemed unsurmountable, huge even, but at least they knew what they had to do, and they just only had to figure out how to do it. We live in the inverse many times, where if only we knew what we were to do, then we could figure out how to do it. Even this goes back to the famous words of Nietzsche, a man with a why will endure anyhow. And it seems like we are struggling to find that why, and perhaps, maybe I'm going to encourage you in this one, that perhaps that is the burden that we are going to be continuously straddled with for now. Perhaps the fact that we don't get to choose the consequences we don't get to choose the circumstances in which we live. We didn't get to choose the era. We didn't get to choose the family or the birth or our physical and mental attributes. We didn't get to choose all these things. There are many things that we have control over, but what we do get to choose, even in this time where it seems like hope is out of reach and goodness is outside of our capabilities, and the idea of someone being proud of us for our achievements or honoring our fathers seems not capable, or not within reach because of cultural conditions, right? We live in a world that We live in the West. If you live in America, you live in a world that praises that which is evil and abhors that which is good. And it creates a sense of gloom that we're not surrounded by having a dragon to fight, but rather the cultural issues around us are like cockroaches. They just don't go away. No matter how effectively you articulate their wickedness, or you effectively dismantle in the idea of a Ben Shapiro, own the libs, whatever you want to call it, whatever your phrase is, it doesn't matter what you do. It just doesn't go away. There isn't a clear term for victory. The president of Harvard, the greatest academic institution of America, has to resign in shame, not because she's a plagiarist, but because she didn't support the right people for the right mob. Or maybe there's more to it. It's not hard to look out into the world and to find things to complain about. It's not hard to look out into the sort of nostalgia reign of going back to the 90s when there were heroes and villains and we could figure out how to save the day. Maybe it is our responsibility in this generation to cut a pathway forward, even though it will receive no credit. History is painted. History, if we were to have the omniscience, say, of an all-knowing God, I think what we would end up finding, I believe very strongly that what we would end up finding is that so many people in history fulfilled that maxim that you truly are who you are when you are in a place where no one is observing you. There is this old Greek story that had an influence on the book The Lord of the Rings, but it has to do with a man finds a magic ring that makes him invisible, and the question is, who is he when no one knows that he is doing it, when no one can hold him accountable? Who is he when even his own conscience is under investigation? So this... But if you were to take that concept, right, if you could take this concept that we are taught oftentimes as children and young adults, that you truly are who you are when no one is looking, what happens if we take that idea and we expand it to the entirety of your life? That you are, the good or evil that you do in your life is truly who you are and what you will do, because it may never reach the history book. And so this might serve as an opportunity that it might actually be, I hope it comes across as freeing, that it is liberating to know that the actions that you have will go unnoticed, will likely go unnoticed, but it doesn't take away from whether or not you did them and whether or not you did them to do good. And so when we look at the world that we live in, it may not be our fault that the economy is in shambles. It may not be our fault that we are growing up in a world where war is everywhere, but not for great reasons even. They're just kind of petty or small. We may live in a world where the wicked succeed and the good suffer. We may live in a world that doesn't have the great academic minds of those that came before us, but rather, if we go into academia, we are surrounded by fools and plagiarists. We may not live in the world that we would idealize, but we do live in the world that we are in, and we may not be responsible for the circumstances that we are going to live our lives in or be raised in, but we are responsible for what we do with the time that we have. We are responsible for the good that we can do with what we have available to us. So instead of being dismayed that we can't solve the world's problems because the situation has been set up by those who will never pay the price to be by all measure of our perception, hopeless, what we can do is seek for the good that we can do with what we have available to us. We may not be able to fix the country, but we can influence our city council. We may not be able to end the war in Ukraine, but we can have an encouraging factor amongst those who are around us. We may not be able to we may not be able to close down this new unholy church that is rising in the government, that is the worship of man and the worship of state, but we can encourage in those amongst us and around us, those that we have relationships with, to seek that which is true, not that which is expedient, or do not worship a false god. We may not be able to have the impact that Billy Graham had on the world, or at least the scale of his, what do you call it? Example being, we may not be able to create so much of a ruckus as one like Billy Graham, but we can participate in what we have. Not every one of us is going to be a theologian like Jonathan Edwards, and not every one of us is going to be a warrior like Billy Waugh, but each one of us does have something before us that we can do, that we ought do, and hopefully that we will do. So if this episode has been an encouragement to you, go ahead. You can find plenty of ways to support us. At this time, we have a couple of new patches up. We've got some patches up on the site, and that's at redactedllc.com. There you can find out about upcoming events too. If you're in the Utah area and you are watching this around the time of its release, July 6th, we're doing a public land cleanup in your area. And with that, we will close. So if you want to support us, obsidianarms.com, you can go over to redactedllc.com, or you can go to redactedculture.locals.com. Any one of those places, you can find ways to keep this show on the road. That being the case, in closing, go forth and conquer.